started. I have got the webinar being recorded for those that are interested in listening to the playback. Actually, as I go through this presentation, I will give you a URL that you guys can have access to that will give you an ability to log in to our teachable platform, our learning platform, and give access to this in a recorded format. Actually, we pre-recorded this webinar already. And so if you're interested in either going back through it again and actually hearing Donna present her slides, because I think I'm gonna have to do her slides right now, then you will be able to hear her side of the presentation, probably a little bit better than I can do it, but we'll wing it as we go. So for those that are attending, welcome to the ERP Risk Advisors What's New in 23B discussion. I'm Jeff Hare, CEO and founder of ERP Risk Advisors. My co-host should be Donna Curtis. We're having some technical difficulties. I think she can't be presenting the slides, so I'll be presenting the slides on her behalf today. Donna is our ERP Cloud Practice Manager, and we are very excited to bring you this topic. So our agenda for this discussion is simple. We're going to cover some prerequisites. Then we will introduce myself and Donna a little bit more detailed. While there are many important changes in 23B, we're going to be focusing on one critical topic. Oracle released a fix to a critical flaw, a design gap, if you will, related to the AD-FDI and FBDI process related to journal entries. And this has been a topic that's been outstanding for a long time. So we're going to cover the background related to the issue, looking at 2 enhancement requests via Customer Connect. Then also we're going to look at the Oracle README, review the process as it existed prior to the 23 patch, review the new process after the 23B patch, and then go over some notes to which you're going to want to pay close attention. Finally, then we're going to present how ERP Armor, which is our risk content, can help identify, manage, and mitigate risks. So whenever we develop a course, we have some suggested prerequisites. So we have a pretty extensive training library or learning library, and there's always lots of information that I think would be helpful, I think, to understand the context of this. So we have some suggested prerequisites. If you're listening to this in the recorded version and you're not familiar with the topics we're talking about from a prerequisite perspective, then you might want to go back and sign up for those classes. So the suggested prerequisites would be, first, we recommend the course, what's called the Understanding Systemic Issues in the ERP Software, System Integrator, and External Audit and Internal Audit Industries. This kind of helps answer the why questions when you see why there are sometimes less than optimal implementation of internal controls as it relates to the implementation of an ERP system. Next, we'd recommend the class, Current Issues We're Seeing in the External Audit Community. I've had the privilege of teaching the PCOB several times. This would be more like what we have been teaching the PCOB. We aren't in a current relationship with them right now, but we continue to message to them some of the issues we're seeing in the community. And I think it'd be good to pay attention to what we're seeing as kind of some gaps or systemic issues in the external audit community. There are definitely issues we have emphasized in our prior teaching with PCOB, and I think we've already started to see some impact of those working their way through the audit community as inspectors have kind of gone in and looked at some of the ways that audits are being performed and ways that they are expecting the external auditors to perform in a more complete and accurate and comprehensive manner. These first 2 classes I mentioned are paid courses. The next 2 courses are free courses where we do offer continuing education. So just about all of our classes that in our learning platform, we offer continuing education. So if you're a CISA or a CIA or a CISSP or some other thing, CFE would be another designation that would qualify for continuing education. So the first of the 2 courses that are free is from our webinar related to 23A, which we did earlier this year. The second is a webinar Donna did last year, and the teaching Donna did on role design and their components is really outstanding. So you won't want to miss that. Both of those are available by going to our website, erpra.net, and clicking on the learning link. And then you get to the browse course catalog, and you'll see you can actually filter by who the author is of those courses. So both the 23A class and the custom roles, data security policies, privileges class, those are both under Donna's component. So those who've been following Donna's work will appreciate those classes. So introductions, introduce myself, founder and CEO of ERP Risk Advisors. I am a CPA by trade with internal audit designation, CIA and CASA. Have been in the space for over 25 years, starting since 1997. I implemented the applications. eBusiness Suite as the controller. For those that aren't familiar, eBusiness Suite is really the predecessor or the older version, the on-prem version of ERP Cloud. ERP Cloud is very different than EBS, but it has a lot of similarities to eBusiness Suite in many respects. Wrote a couple books in the EBS space, and been teaching auditors on ERP Cloud classes with a lot of the material that Donna and I put together for the last 5 or 6 years. Donna is our ERP Cloud practice lead. She is my right-hand person, so to speak. She has been in this space for, I think, over 25 years now as well, from EBS and a cloud consultant. She has 10 years experience in Oracle Advanced Controls, which is the on-prem version of Risk Management Cloud, AACG, CCG, TCG, and GRC, CM. You might recognize those modules if you've been around the space for a while. She helped in writing the Oracle Financial Reporting Compliance certification exam. She spent several years in a Big Four environment and other boutiques, and she's definitely the expert on our team in ERP and HCM Cloud role design. A good chunk of her day is spent supporting clients that are going live with ERP and HCM Cloud, as well as helping our existing clients continue to manage those risks on an ongoing basis. For example, as we look through this class, we'll see that we have just closed our 23B release. I'll talk about our release process later on. And now she's going to start working with our clients that are long-term kind of managed service customers of ours to implement this change that we're going to talk about today related to FBDI and ADFDI processes for the journal entries. So from a background perspective, diving into the detail, a lot of organizations are recognizing there's a pretty massive shift in the use of ERP applications. We're seeing a lot of ERP and HCM cloud implementations. Oracle's done a great job at putting together a product that has many new workflows, a lot of automated processes. And one of the things we're going to dive into today is this ability to load transactions via FBDI, which stands for File-Based Data Import Process. And what we're seeing historically as FBDI processes are really used for the loading and converting of data as part of the implementation. And it could be that you would use those in the context of what we would call like manual interfaces. The distinct feature of FBDI processes, predominantly, they are not something that are subject to the workflow approval process. So like, for example, if you're loading GL balances or open AP transactions or open era transactions, and you're doing that as part of the conversion, you don't need those to go through an approval process. Those are pre-approved, if you will, or coming from other systems. So when we think about FBDI processes, there are privileges that bypass workflow approval or are not subject to workflow approval once the system is live, and generally those are things that should be limited, if not removed altogether from a role design perspective after go live. I say limited because there are potentially some use cases where FBDI templates and processes throughout the application could be and need to be used for updating data. The one I'm going to pick on today as part of our presentation is related to journal entries. I think most people would understand and agree that the journal approval, entry approval process is one of the most significant risks for organizations subject to Sarbanes-Oxley and other compliance requirements throughout the world. Unfortunately, oftentimes system integrators really aren't aware of the significance of these issues. That's not their day job, is managing audit risk or even security risk. The system integrators are really focused on the implementation of the applications, getting the applications up and running on time, on budget. And so what happens often is auditors are the last line of defense. So if system integrators aren't bringing these things to management, hopefully auditors will identify these risks. And unfortunately, we rarely see auditors really focusing on these, what we would call sensitive access risks, the FBDI privileges, and particularly the privileges in and around journal entries. So what that often leaves is, even though management's responsible for defining the controls, they're left with the potential for control efficiency, in particular in the area where we talk about just where you cannot distinguish between an activity that's controlled by a workflow and those that are not controlled by a workflow. And so we're gonna differentiate between those that are not controlled by workflow, which would be an FBDI process, versus those that are controlled by a workflow, which we'll bring up in a second, talking about the ADFDI process. So the gap that we're going to talk about today, the background is, for years there's been a privilege in ERP Cloud that gives users in general, but specifically accountants, having the ability to enter and maintain journal entries. It gives the accountants the ability to bypass the journal entry workflow process. This was first presented as an enhancement request by a Deloitte consultant in September 2020 through, if you're not familiar with a mechanism called Customer Connect, which is a website. It's a social media construct that Oracle has that is unique to ERP Cloud. It didn't exist in EBS. And what it does is it allows people to interact with each other on certain topics. So you can ask questions. You can also present enhancements requests, which in the context of the Customer Connect website, they're called ideas. So you present an idea, others can see the idea, can vote on those, and as Oracle sees the votes or sees the inherent value of enhancements requests or ideas, they will take action on them and eventually deliver those. And there's been many enhancements requests that we have implemented, or we have suggested. Some of that have been implemented, and we continue to follow a lot of the enhancements requests related to what we call the security and control space, or the GRC space. That's really our niche. Our niche is not understanding all the functionality related to the ERP Cloud and HCM Cloud systems, but it's understanding how do we secure and control those modules. So the background on this, the delivered idea we're going to talk about in 23B, we finally see a new privilege provided by Oracle that can be used to fix the gap. And the gap is that there is a privilege that allows somebody to do a journal entry, and at the time they are doing the journal entry, they could effectively use an FBDI template. And I talk about template, that is the spreadsheet import process, or they could use an ADFDI template. So this is a huge win for the end user community. You can click on the online link, or if you want access to this link, we can give you the URL. So if you don't want to retype this or don't have access to this PowerPoint presentation, you actually go online to Customer Connect, and this, I think the ID is the 556, whatever that number is in there. And you can see as I click on this link, it's going to take me directly to the Customer Connect website where I'm logged in. And I mentioned that this was originally filed by Torben Billow, who's a Deloitte consultant. I think he's working on behalf of Lyft at the time. And I'll go back to the slides here in a second, but the key point here is we need there to be separate privileges so that the post journal entry, the general ledger, doesn't give access to the import journals and the run import journals program. So effectively what it means is having access to this privilege prior to this change is you could determine whether or not you wanted to load a process via ADFDI, which would use the default source of spreadsheet. And that normally would be subject to journal approval workflow, and that's set in what's called a journal sources form or configuration. But it also gives you the ability to load a journal entry through the FBDI template. So that's really the gap, is up until this point where this fix is being introduced in 23B. an accountant could choose an FBDI template, and an FBDI template would allow them to choose a source that would not be subject to the journal approval workflow. So that's really the key challenge here, is the use of the FBDI template, which is supposed to be used for conversions or manual interfaces. They can choose whatever source they want through that, versus the ADFDI defaults to the source of spreadsheet, and that would be normally set up as part of the manual approval, the journal approval process, as part of the journal sources configuration. So if they had access to have access today to this process, they could use an FBDI template, choose a source that's not subject to the journal approval workflow, and effectively bypass the workflow or the intended controls of workflow by entering a journal entry that would not be subject to review and approval by somebody else. So there's a couple of downsides to this fix. First, it hasn't been deployed to any seeded roles yet, and we're going to cover that in our recommendations towards the end of this learning session. And then second, where it is available to be used, Oracle still hasn't provided the ability to perform look-back procedures to differentiate between FBDI journal entries and ADFDI journal entries. You can see at the very bottom, we define what FBDI and ADFDI are, and have the use of these predefined and pre-built. So I want to go on to the next slide, because the next slide gives a little bit more. It's just a screenshot of this enhancements request. Originally, like I said, filed by a Deloitte security consultant in 2020. I highlighted the key phrase here. It says run import journals program needs to be split to distinguish between ADFDI and FBDI journal entries. I think I've covered. The gap has existed for years, finally logged as an enhancement for it. It wasn't just all of a sudden discovered in 2020. This probably was a gap for several years prior to 2020, but it was finally logged as an enhancement in 2020. And in my opinion, as somebody that knows the audit space really well and understands the implication of this, I think it should have been identified by Oracle and logged as a Sev1 bug. It's really hard to get things logged as a bug. So even if the functionality in the system doesn't do something and you think it should, often what Oracle is requesting is that you log it as an enhancement request. And that is, there's a lot of nuance related to when something is logged as a bug that has to get tracked by Oracle independently in various different systems. So like the DoD and some of the federal contractors, they follow what are quote unquote bugs within the system. So I think the terminology of bug is very specific, and Oracle is always hesitant to log something as a bug when it's maybe a lack of design, if you call it, or improper design. So when you come up with issues like this, where you would look at it and say it's designed wrong, and I would argue in some cases that's a bug, they would argue it's just the design isn't complete, or the design is as the implementation is as the design is intended. So it's kind of a nuance in the audit community, if you will, related to what's defined as a bug versus enhancement request. So there's lots of times where we're identifying gaps in the way the functionality works, or it's not working the way it should. And I can give dozens of examples of this, and we have to log it as an enhancement request because Oracle doesn't want to identify this as a bug. So when this came out, we worked when this October 2020 issue was put out by Torben. What we did is we tried to figure out if there's a workaround for that. So whenever we are looking at something that could potentially cause an audit issue, we look to define what's called look-back procedures. Is there a way to identify whether or not this, functionality, if you will, in this context, the FBDI ability for journal entries, is there a way to identify if it has been executed or being used? So look-back procedures are required by management when they have identified somebody having unauthorized access to an ability, especially those that are in, and I'm using air quotes here, that are financially significant. And that's kind of a terminology in the context of particularly Sarbanes-Oxley in the US. I recognize there's lots of people that aren't probably US based that are listening to this podcast, or they may not be subject to Sarbanes-Oxley because they may not be a publicly traded company. But that is think about it as, could it be cause a material misstatement in the financial statements. That's kind of the intent of the term financially significant. Or it could allow somebody to significantly alter the financial results. So being able to post a journal entry that isn't subject to review and approval by someone else is a very serious risk to an audit. So our goal of logging this enhancements request, so our enhancement request is seeded report to identify if FBDI is being used to enter journal entries. And I'll go and click on this, and I've got a screenshot of this on the next slide as well, but I'll just go through and you can see as I click through this link, having the ability to look at the details if it pulls up. So I'll just go back to my slides and I'll just pull in the slide, but you can see I'm logging in to the Customer Connect site here for the sake of moving forward. I'll continue to move on. So our goal in having the data of identifying if somebody had used the FBDI ability to do journal entries was to help management provide an analysis to the auditors that it has or hasn't been used. If it hasn't been used, then that would be like, even though somebody has access to that ability, it hasn't been used, so that would kind of close the potential risk to the organization. If it had been used, then you'd ask the question, was that activity authorized, and how was the journal entry reviewed for completeness and accuracy? Was it properly approved? You know, was it or was it used to manipulate financial statements? Those kind of the different conditions. So the bummer about this enhancement request, we logged it with Oracle in June of 2021. So it was a few months, it was 8 months or 9 months after the original, actually, yeah, about 9 months, I think, after the original enhancement request was logged by the Deloitte security consultants. And it was, so June 2021, it was opened in about 5 months. November 2021, it was closed. 5 months later, it was closed, and it's called archived. And Oracle doesn't cite specifically why it was closed or archived, but I suspect it was because there's no way or no easy way that they could identify how to differentiate between a journal entry that was created through an ADFDI process versus one that was created by an FBDI process. And frankly, that kind of heightened my fears that this was a gap that couldn't be solved by Oracle. Because if you think about this, Oracle, if they're using ERP Cloud to run their own financials, which I'm assuming they are, would have the same gap in their environment as well. And all publicly traded clients would have that gap. So when I promoted this session, I talked about this potentially or perhaps should have been viewed as a material weakness. And I used that term very carefully, because I know that is for lack of a better term, it's a trigger for external auditors. Like, there's just no way this could be material weakness. There's got to be some sort of mitigating controls related to this. And that's often what happens when there's a control deficiency, is they go through and they identify what mitigating controls are. And there's been one customer that we worked through on this issue, and it was a very extensive process they had to go through to figure out what was FBDI, what was not FBDI. But it was a manual process. There wasn't like a flag somewhere that differentiated at the database level, for example, or in a log somewhere where they could determine whether it was ADFDI or FBDI. So it was a completely manual process they had to do for look-back procedures. So I think what we're asking for here is a programmatic. Is there a flag? Is there a differentiation between FBDI and ADFDI? And that the process that our client went through is a process that all publicly traded companies probably should have been asked to go through on behalf of their external auditors. And the fact that there wasn't something that was easy, and auditors, I think in general, haven't figured out a way, then the auditors would have to say, if I find somebody having access to FBDI journal entry process, which is the same privilege that an accountant would have to do an ADFDI process, and the customer or the end user, the client themselves, could not prove that it hasn't been used, given the fact that journal entries being such a critical control, and would be fairly easy to use to be able to manipulate financial statements. It could very well end up with a material weakness. So what's interesting to me is that we don't have just one client that's been through this. We have lots of publicly traded clients, and we interact with companies that aren't our clients on a regular basis. And none of our clients or prospects have been asked to identify who can enter an FBDI journal entry. I know, for example, another Big Four. I'm not going to pick on Big Four firms here, but we had one of our clients was audited by a Big Four firm. From a security audit perspective, it wasn't their external audit team, it was more the consulting side, and they brought this to their attention. And so I would have thought that firm would have looked at it both from a consulting perspective and from a external audit perspective. I would expect there's some level of communication when there's a gap that the SI or the consulting side, the risk advisory side, would identify that would be communicated to the external audit teams, so the external audit teams can be aware of auditing for those risks in their financial statement audit. So I've never seen this audited as a risk, not that it hasn't in some cases, but it's our experience is that external auditors and internal auditors that are working on behalf of management to test controls have not raised this as an issue. So this was what I was trying to pull up in the in Customer Connect. As you can see, my documentation. I go through, you know, the issue here, reference to the post itself where Torben had done this, and then go through and effectively say we need management has users with access to upload journal entries to FBDI, which is inherently all accountants had access to it, but are not authorized probably to do so. So organizations subject to SOX need to be able to execute look-back procedures. And since this is a systemic issue throughout the entire organization, every organization running ERP Cloud would have had the same issue. The right answer would have been Oracle should provide the seeded report. So you can see I logged this originally June 2021. It was closed November 2021, so about 5-6 months later, and there was no reason for the closure. Now, there are cases where things that don't get a lot of votes often get archived. This did not get closed as part of the kind of archiving process where we see number of low votes. Matter of fact, there's 26 unique votes, and typically we see once something has reached a minimum of 20 organizational votes, it will hang out there forever until Oracle either decides to do something about it or, well, it doesn't get archived, let's put it that way. So that's kind of the background related to this. And unfortunately, I can't get Donna on still from an audio perspective. So I'm going to pretend to be Donna, and I'm going to get into the next section where we're talking about this Oracle README summary. So what we're going to walk through is the documentation that Oracle puts out to explain the new process or the updates in what are called READMEs. So the Oracle README for 23B can be accessed via the link on the slide. So if I click on this, it would take me to the support page, the Oracle 23 Update 23B README. And if you don't have access to this, you should have access if you are supporting the application. The title of the new process is Security Access Segregation of Import Journals from File-Based Desktop Import Process for Journals. So as we said, this issue came from the Customer Connect enhancement that was logged September 2020. It took a while to Oracle, but there's a fix. It's not like a perfect fix, but there's a decent fix that has just come out in 23B. So the new process comes with two privileges, and the first one's called Run Import Journal Program without FBDI access, and the second one is called Post Subledger Journal Entry to the General Ledger, No Journal Import Access for FBDI. So you can see those two privileges on this slide. So let's look at the process of how it worked before 23B and existing privileges. So prior to 23B, there were two privileges: post subledger journal entry to general ledger and run import journals program. The run import journals program allowed the ability to run the create accounting process and the import journals process using an FBDI template. This run import journals program would be something that would be in a seated role for like the general accountant and general accounting manager, I think is where it's, but it's in a couple of roles that are typically assigned to accountants, and would be in the custom versions of those roles almost 100% of the time. You would expect those to be in custom versions of the accountant roles. So let me explain a little bit about the FBDI process. The FBDI process is a two-step process, and the run import journals program is step 2. So step 1 is the loading of the FBDI journal entry. So that's the Excel spreadsheet that's being used to populate the data. You upload that FBDI journal into the interface tables, and that's just basically putting into a staging table. It doesn't bring it all the way into the interface. So the privilege to do step 1 of the process is called load interface file for import, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Step 2 performs the actual importing of the FBDI journals into Oracle from the interface tables. So that takes it into the base tables. So like GL header, GL lines, and GL batches tables, I think are where the tables are. And that is what step 2 does. The run import journals program has really no bearing on the import journals using ADFDI. So this run import journals program is really just the process that's being used for FBDI uploads. So to enable a user to create accounting, they would also need to have access to this this privilege. And in the prior to 23B, there was no way to separate these processes. So create accounting, whenever a user runs the create accounting process, it also runs the journal imports program and pulls whatever subledger journal entry that's creating into the general ledger. It also would pull in any files that are in the import, so the FBDI templates as well. So if somebody has uploaded a journal entry, an FBDI journal entry into the inbound directory, whenever somebody else would be running that create accounting process, and that also then triggering the run import journal program, it would pull all those FBDI journal entries in for programming as well. So the privilege is required for the create accounting functionality to work. The user also then has the risk of being able to perform step 2, the importing of the FBDI templates, when they should not. And that's really the rub here, is having the ability to run normal create accounting processes, or if the create accounting process is scheduled to run on a periodic basis to pull in subledger journal entries, it's going to run that data in for FBDI journal entries. So the privilege run import journals program allowed users to access the process import journals via the scheduled processes and run it successfully. Since this privilege was also needed to allow users to run the create accounting process, you had to accept the risk of a user that could create accounting also being able to run the FBDI journal entry process. And that became the huge auditing risk that ultimately drove the enhancements request in November 2020. So if they use an FBDI template, they could choose any source. And this is really the rub. It's trying to think about the way that sources or journal sources are set up. Normally you'd expect like manual journal entries and ADFDI, which would be spreadsheet source journal entries, to go through the journal approval process. But other subledgers like payables, assets, and so on are not subject to the journal approval workflow. You expect those sources to have the right controls within them, within the subledgers. So when they come into the general ledger itself, those are not subject to the journal approval workflow. They're usually auto-posted. So that's the challenge. If they use an FBDI template, they can choose any source, including one from the subledger source that would not be subject to the journal approval workflow. Whereas the use of an ADFDI template defaults to the source of spreadsheet, which I've mentioned, and this is really the identification of the risk that led to the enhancement. So now let's explain the process after 23B. So there's 2 new privileges being introduced. However, oddly enough, neither of these 2 privileges are assigned to any seated roles. The names of these privileges are post subledger journal entry to the general ledger, no journal import for FBDI, and run import journals program without FBDI access. These new privileges do the same thing as the existing privileges do, as in they allow the create accounting function to work, but now they do not allow the importing of journals for FBDI, which does sound like a good thing. So the good news about 23B, the new privileges, is they all allow the end user organizations to solve the audit issue that has plagued them for years. They can provide the ability to run the import journals program without giving them access to the import to import a journal entry via the FBDI template. Given the fact that using the FBDI template would likely allow them to bypass the workflow approval process by choosing a source that's not subject to the journal approval workflow, this is a huge win for the audit community. And for management, obviously, for them to avoid some of these audit issues we've talked about. However, oddly enough, the replacement of the old privilege, which is run import journals program, with a new privilege, run import journals program without FBDI access, has some flaws. The README says that the user can run the process and it will complete successfully, but it will complete in error. This is the stated functionality per the README, which is a little odd. Look at the slide. It shows the error log for the process after it runs. The message states the request to load, purge the interface for import with the import journal process cannot be completed because of insufficient permissions. Well, Donna did test this extensively, and it's not exactly correct. She did quite a bit of testing, and the new privilege still allows the user the ability to select the import journal process from the scheduled process. But let's look at the next slide, I think, for a little more detail. So the new privilege, run import journals program without FBDI access, will allow a user to access the import journal program from either scheduled process area or from the journals area in the GL. It will allow a user to enter the source, selecting the list of values, with the ability to choose from a source that isn't subject to the journal approval workflow. Where this process is stopped is when the user tries to enter the ledger. So it almost looks like they can complete the whole process, but when they go to enter the ledger, which is a required field, the list of values will not populate. So if you're in a position of trying to explain, like, let's say you fix this issue after 23B. Now 23B is probably in most of your environments. This is still going to cause a lot of confusion with the external auditors if they haven't watched this webinar and they haven't really dove deep into this fix, because it's going to seem like they can still do it. But the reality is, I think you have to go through this process and show that they really can't complete the process as a whole. So you can see the red arrow that can be used for the drop down for the ledger, but it won't populate. So this just means the process can't be run, which is a good thing. So some additional notes that Donna presented for the slides. And per Oracle, we've confirmed with this testing on our own. Never always take Oracle's word for it whenever something comes in release notes. So you do not need these privileges to upload journal entries, since using the FDDI process. So your FDDI process isn't changing. This is just a spreadsheet based process, FBDI, and does not have anything to do with ADFDI. So the 2 new privileges are required to run create accounting. So if you choose not to allow somebody to use the FBDI process, which is what we would normally recommend, and you're still wanting your users to run the create accounting process, you will need these new privileges. And I think that's where it's going to cause confusion with the external auditors and internal auditors. It's going to probably take quite a while for them to fully embrace that gap in the last slide we looked at. And then as I mentioned before, these new privileges are not assigned to seated roles. So to use them, if you haven't customized the roles, you're going to have to customize the roles, and you're going to have to substitute them in your current custom roles where you've already customized the roles. So you're going to want to pull out the old version of these and put the new version in. And then if it's a situation where your users do not use the FBI process, which we would recommend that they don't, and they do not use create accounting at all. So perhaps you have the create accounting process run as a scheduled job through like a service account on a periodic basis. That may be how it's done predominantly most of the time, but sometimes there are end users that will want to and need to run the create accounting process. But if, like, for example, no user should do create accounting, then these two permissions could be would not be needed. So our recommendations, the FBDI and ADFDI privileges should be segregated. End user accountants should be assigned the ADFDI privilege only. This is just in general. They shouldn't have both processes. They shouldn't need access to FBDI privileges. Should only be assigned to those that would have the authorization to bypass journal approval workflow, which typically is never, very rarely, if never. So whether we've talked about the sources, and what you might want to do if you become more familiar with this topic is go look at how your journal sources are configured. Because each source itself, like payables, receivables, cost accounting, those could be turn on or turn off. Typically, they're not subject to the journal approval workflow, but they are set to frozen, most of the subledger sources, so they can't be changed once they are imported into the general ledger and before they are posted. All right, so additional notes. Donna has logged another enhancement to this process based upon the gap we looked at in the prior screens. So I invite you to go check this out and see and hopefully support this enhancements request. It's just trying to bridge the gap of what we talked about with the gap of the ledger thing, and it looking like it works, and it's not actually working. So that's the gist of what we wanted to cover in this. I'm going to do an overview of ERP Risk Advisors and talk through what we do. So we talk about how to identify, manage, and mitigate risks. And some of you may know what we do. I'm definitely going to present some new information here that we haven't. We've been, I guess, a little bit shy in some respects about some of the things we do. And so this is going to be a brief overview of ERP Risk Advisors and particularly our product, ERP Armor. So I think one of the challenges for organizations with access controls in general, we just focused on one very, very important, but one little minute fact issue related to a couple privileges in the journal entry area. And I'm going to broaden this back up to access controls, which access controls really, what I would say, form the foundation of your overall control environment. Often what we see is too narrow of a focus when it comes to access controls. Most organizations that are publicly traded understand the rat race that's Sarbanes-Oxley and the struggles to keep auditors happy. However, access controls span many other objectives, including cybersecurity, data security, and day-to-day, like what I would consider like sub-material fraud or fraud below the materiality level. Additionally, a lot of our practice right now is being driven by organization with license exposure. So what that means is Oracle's pulling the license reports from the Cloud Console, and they're finding significant license overages. And license exposure definitely puts organizations at risk for being billed, obviously, for modules that are not being used or for more licenses that are being consumed than have been purchased. So that's a big part of what our practice is doing right now, is working through with customers to remediate roles, provisioning. A lot of it's customizing roles and breaking apart where a role may have access to multiple or several license buckets within it that not all users are required to have. But I think a lot of other, one other thing, I think it's organizations in general just don't think of as cybersecurity risks because with SaaS applications, because they think of securing the perimeter, and they're really relying upon Oracle's maintenance of the firewall here, nobody getting access to be able to maintain that data. But there are configurations that have to be managed in and around SSO and multi-factor authentication, MFA. It's a complex environment, and often there's several different groups of users. You could have all users, you could have core users, you have supplier users, customers. So the internet-facing applications could have certain buckets of users that are not subject to multi-factor authentication, allowing them to be vulnerable to phishing attacks. And we've definitely seen examples where customers have supplier portal pushed out, and those supplier logins are not subject to multi-factor authentication, not subject to the same Active Directory two-factor authentication that internal employees would have, where there have been breaches, phishing attacks, successful phishing attacks, and fraud committed through a threat actor coming in and changing the bank account to a fraudulent bank account for those supplier payments. So there's a lot of other factors behind access control testing other than just typical Sarbanes-Oxley or compliance. We have a subscription that we call ERP Armor. And so what we like to present, what I'm going to present here is just a little bit about ERP Armor and how we feel like there's a value to organizations on an ongoing basis. And it really starts with system integrators. Often system integrators don't really understand risks in seated roles and the necessity of customizing roles to reduce security and compliance risks and reduce license costs. So the job of a system integrator is to bring up the system on time, on budget, and they don't really have the capacity, I think, to explain to management in most cases the risks associated with either additional licenses or things that are inherent in seated roles that shouldn't be there. So when you go through regression testing within a project, a system integrator is going to use those seated roles, and Oracle is going to build those to process payables and process receivables and setting up customers and all those things. But the question that doesn't get asked during an implementation is, what else can those roles do that my users should not have access to? So that is what we would call a systemic issue in the SI, the system integrator industry. Part of it is lack of knowledge, and then part of it is as an SI decides they're going to present these risks or management's going to want to build these in, then that SI could be at a disadvantage of having a more expensive project relative to somebody else that advocates the full use of seated roles. So from our perspective on the security and compliance side, seated roles are often over provisioned. It means they can do things that they shouldn't be able to do. So for example, in those general accountant roles, as we talked about in this webinar, they have the ability to do FBDI privileges, and both SIs and the audit community haven't really, in my opinion, woken up to the reality of why that is such a significant risk. So unless a system integrator educates management as to these risks and seated roles, they often don't incorporate into the project. Sometimes, like I said, system integrators are often too afraid to fully educate management, as may make their bid more expensive then, and therefore they may lose the bid. So it's ultimately management's responsibility for scoping the project, and they need to ask some of these tough questions with their system integrators and other partners about these issues before they award bids. Doing so or not doing so, I think, could put their project at risk, and it could put, and frankly, their jobs at risk if they don't identify these, and there's either overages in the project that are not identified, or there are worst case scenario audit findings that come down the road. I think in general, I would say auditors are overemphasizing Sarbanes-Oxley risks and underemphasizing other risks. Cybersecurity, data security, circumventing controls, like we talked about. Those FBDI privilege that I mentioned, those are available throughout the entire application. Like every transaction and every master data that has to be converted from legacy system to ERP cloud have FBDI privileges. So it's not just journal entry risks that have to be secured, but it's other activities as well post go live. So I have a question for you. How is your organization identifying the impact of quarterly patches on your application security posture and your license risk? So that's what we help management do, is we help keep current the content that would need to be reviewed on an ongoing basis. So that's what ERP Armor is it is content that goes into software scanning engines that allows management to identify both SOD and sensitive access risks, as well as license risk. So we are not a software company. We're what we call a risk content company. We work with pretty much all the major software companies And we have tested to make sure that the major software companies in this area have the ability to completely and accurately test access control risks using our content. So that's where we go through a certification program when we bring on new software providers. So without access control software, or at least a quarterly assessment, how are you making certain that you properly identified, managed, and mitigated risks introduced by the patch? And this is partly why we changed our business model a few years ago. We were traditionally a risk advisory firm, and what we found is a gap in the market. If you implement, let's say you implement Risk Management Cloud, Oracle's Risk Management Cloud, the advanced access control product, and you implement that part of your go live, if you don't stay current with the feature releases that are happening on an ongoing basis, eventually the use of that tool becomes stale. So you're not managing all the risks. You may not be managing risks accurately. So we decided to just transition from a risk advisory firm to a what we call risk content firm that provides the updates each quarter. So Donna and team, they go through and analyze every new privilege that's being introduced and evaluate whether those privileges have risks or not. And then we deploy a new set of content, if you will. We identify new rules, and we work with our customers to be able to update their software scanning engines to be able to introduce and evaluate new risks on an ongoing basis. So we're filling a gap in the market that has existed for a long time, which is, if you want a refresh of the content, either you got to have a process to do that internally, or you have to go out and hire somebody else on an ongoing basis or recurring basis to be able to update the content, the SOD and sensitive access risk, the privileges, duty roles, and data security policies that are a part of that scanning process. I'm going to kind of skip through some of these slides. I'm going to say I've got about 5 minutes left, and one of the things I will say, if you're getting towards the end of this and you want to revisit this content, we have this all pre-recorded. So Don and I did pre-record this webinar, and it's available. And at the very last slide, I'll give you instructions on how to pull the data. And I go through all these slides in a lot more detail. Well, I just don't think I'll have enough time to get through it in the time that we have to close out. But we're access control experts, right? So Don and I have been in this space for 25 years. The team around us that we built on an ongoing basis helps us identify the changes in the applications. We don't just do ERP Cloud, but we do lots of products in this space. EBS and PeopleSoft and JD Edwards and you know, I think there's a dozen or so different ERP systems we're supporting. In general, organizations don't fully understand and grasp the risk related to access controls. And so when we are onboarding new customers, we're trying to give them the full breadth of what they should be doing with access control software. So it's role design, it's user provisioning, it's integrating that data into user access reviews. When a role is changed, added, or removed, you want to go through a process of evaluating things. When a patch is being implemented, we just talked about that. When development happens, so in on-prem systems, when a new object is being developed, even in a SaaS system, when you have a new report that is being deployed and that report can be registered as a privileged, and that report has sensitive data, PII or PHI or something, data subject to GDPR, you want to be able to track who has access to that object. There's cyber incident risk analysis. How do you identify what the impact of a breach is when somebody's credentials have been compromised? A big thing, massive gap in the audit community right now is testing the independence of control performers. That's a training in and of itself. And that is the people that are performing controls. So if those of you have been around for a long time, management override controls was the primary driver behind Sarbanes-Oxley being implemented back in the early 2000s. Management was overriding controls. Management is still overriding controls. FTX is a great example of that, where Sam Bankman-Fried had access to be able to manipulate the assets within FTX. He got access to different tokens to be able to move data, move money, and fraudulently, presumably fraudulently take that data offline and hide it from auditors and such. That's management override controls. The entire audit community right now, from what we can tell, is not really testing the independence of control performers, which is a huge tragedy, I think, in many respects, of the value that Sarbanes-Oxley is or is not being provided to investors. I could go on that for a while. I'm passionate about that gap. Look back procedures, license exposure. We have we are not a software company. We're a risk content company. We certify our ability to deliver good data with several different partners. You can see the list here, not in any order of preference. This is alphabetical by choice. So Chaosys, Config Snapshot, FastPath, Oracle's Risk Management Cloud, PathLock, SafePath, Securing, and soon I think we'll be onboarding SailPoint as a partner. And we have been on the front of a couple other topics. I'm not going to go through this. Some of you guys have heard about how we identified a major gap of material fraud risk in the employee role, where the employee role had at one point import supplier bank accounts and the FSCM load interface administration duty role. There are still lots of roles that have import supplier bank accounts. Here's our idea that we logged. It was finally delivered. Took about 18 months, if I remember correctly, to deliver that. You can go figure out how many roles have access to import supplier bank accounts. What import supplier bank accounts does, it's an FBDI process that creates a new bank account and sets it as the default bank account for a supplier. You could do this literally for all suppliers through this process. So it is a very significant fraud risk. And you can figure out what roles both seeded and custom have access by going in Security Console. The FSCM load interface administration, which got taken out of the employee role, is another significant gap. I go to this in a lot more detail in the training that you would have access to if you want access to it. And then we do, so if you don't have software already, we have relationships with various software partners where we can deliver the data to you as a service. We call that ERP Armor as a service. If you subscribe to our updates via the rules or as a service, you always get updates every quarter. You're always getting the latest information. And we do allow for ongoing calls, feedback on role design, basic audit support, and we will teach your team how to do role remediation internally with a 3-year subscription. So if you don't have the budget to be able to do it, we can teach your team how to do the remediation, and you guys can decide to do it at your pace. We are the cheapest in the market for what we call ERP Armor as a service or assessment pricing. We are the cheapest. I think we're the cheapest, and we're probably the best. So we have a one-time assessments, either 15,000 or 20,000. We have recurring assessments. You should be in a recurring posture of either using software, one of our software partners, and managing it internally, or using us to help you manage these risks on an ongoing basis. So you can see the pricing on these. We have many customers that use our service on a quarterly basis. They evaluate risks after the patch. They know they're getting the latest content on our updates, and they're proactively managing the risk on an ongoing basis. We have a long track record for the last couple of years. You can see the growth of our release. We are currently monitoring 2,900 objects, which includes 2,600 privileges, 349 duty roles. And we can look at who has access to those via our sensitive access rules. We do some things that like nobody else does. We can also manage license risk on an ongoing basis. We continue to monitor the license privileges that cause license exposure. Remediation, I would say there's a lot of remediation needs to be done in the market, probably within your organization, and you just aren't fully aware of it. We are looking for system integrators as partners. We have more work than we know what to do with right now from a remediation perspective. And it's partly why we're trying to advocate for organizations doing some of the remediation internally. But if you want to have a discussion on that, happy to have an offline discussion. We also then introduced a new subscription recently, which is trying to stay current on audit logging and reporting. So we look at what's new in the release every year or every quarter for audit policies. There's an ongoing evolution of audit policies and logging, and those are also very important to keep current from an external audit perspective. Should always be enabling what's new that Oracle is being introducing. There are a lot of gaps that Oracle has not filled. Like there's No logging whatsoever for purchasing. There's very little auditing for procurement or projects. And there are things that we would consider bugs, and there's just gaps in logging that really management should think about using other mechanisms for supplementing. Donna also has taught a class that makes the understanding the audit logs a lot more simple. So that comes with a subscription, and she keeps that class current as we see things new that need to be added in. We also have an extensive amount of learning classes for auditors in particular, but we have a class coming out here in a couple of weeks for ERP Cloud Application Security Administration and Best Practices. Donna and Joshua have been working on that class for a while, and if you need training for your security administrators over ERP and HCM Cloud, especially for people that are brand new and have no basis, you've gone live, maybe new people rotating in, that would be a class that would be essential for them to be able to take and have access to. Both Donna's class and Joshua's and Donna's class on security administration come with office hours. So we have drop-in office hours where you can come in and ask questions on a monthly basis if something's not covered in the training or you want clarification. Lastly, recorded version of this webinar is available. It's not on our website yet, but I did in this webinar link. So you can go back to LinkedIn, and I put a post this morning that gave you the link to click on that. It's going to be on our webinar in the next couple of days. And then last but not least, if you have any questions or feedback or question on this topic, we look and feel a lot like a software company, even though we're not. We're a risk content company. We have a full support desk. So you could email us at support@erpra.net. It opens a ticket if you just want to have a conversation with us about something we covered today, or interested in learning more about some of our products. That may be a great way to reach out. So I apologize for going a little bit long, and I apologize that most importantly that Donna wasn't able to present her content. I probably didn't do it justice, but if you want to go back to this link, and you can want to click on this, if there's other people in your organization that want access to this webinar in recorded format, you can click on this link and they can register there, and they are subject to CPE. Or if you want to review this data in a recorded format and want to get CPE for it, you can click on this webinar as well. And if you have any questions or want to drop me a link, I would feel free to connect with both myself and Donna, who are the two drivers behind most of the content in this presentation. And if you're coming to Ascend, we will see you at the Ascend conference in Orlando in a week and a half or so, or a little over a week. Thank you for your time. Appreciate you hanging in there and your patience for going a little bit long. And I wish you guys a great day. Take care.